We're talking today with Mr. Robert Pearson of Grand Rapids, Michigan, the interviewer.
Dr. Robert Pearson.
Dr. Robert Pearson, all right, of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer, if we're going to do that, is Dr. James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Okay. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background? Where were you born, for example, and where did you grow up?
I was born in Toledo, Ohio. Lived most of my life in Michigan, Detroit, Lansing, Traverse City, up and around. My father was a CPA and specialized in putting small trucking companies on their feet and setting up a set of books for them, that sort of thing, and then hiring out to some other similar company. And he broke his back in 1939, and when he finally recovered enough, he went into hospital administration in Detroit and was controller at Harper Hospital.
Okay. Now, when he was doing the work for the trucking companies, was he able to find regular work in the 30s?
Yeah. But at times things were pretty bad. We were poor but didn't know it. We lost an automobile because we couldn't find the $75 to rescue it from repossession. And but everybody else was poor too, so we didn't really pay much attention to that.
Now, where did you go to high school?
Highland Park Junior College in the Detroit area, and I graduated from Northern High School in Detroit.
All right. And then in what year did you finish junior college?
Junior college?
Yeah.
Well, that was after the war.
Oh, that's after the war, okay. So did you go into the Army directly out of high school?
No. In January of '41, I would have normally graduated in June. In January of '41, the boys' counselor called a few of us, I don't remember how many it was, 6, 8 of us, and told us that we had contributed, or we had already finished, the required graduation points, and that if any of us wanted to go into the service then, he would see that we got a diploma in June.
Now, what was the logic of sending people into the service? This is before Pearl Harbor, so America was not at war yet. So
No,
what was?
but we knew there was going to be a war. That's the selling point I used on my father. In those days, you had to be 18 to be in the armed services. I wasn't going to be 18 until the end of April, and I convinced him and mother that the sooner I got in, so I was going to get in eventually, if not drafted, and but the fact is that people generally knew we were going to war. We thought, I guess, that it was going to be with Germany.
Right.
And when I found out on Sunday, December 7th, what had happened at Pearl Harbor, my first response was, where the hell's Pearl Harbor? To a friend of mine. But I had been in, if you can do the math, almost a year before that.
So the idea was to get your service time in before things got ugly.
Well, to have attained some rank or something like that, rather than just to be a GI.
Right. Now, when you enlisted, did you have some options in terms of what branch of service to go into or what kind of duty you might get?
Well, in the physical, I knew what I wanted, but there was no guarantees. The only thing they told us is positively, the sergeant who did the physical, that since I was colorblind, I could be neither an officer nor a pilot. Thereupon, I set my sights on only 2 things I really wanted to be, an officer and a pilot, and I attained both.
Okay. Tell me about the enlistment process and so forth. How did that work? What did you do?
My father and I went down to the federal building, and he signed a paper certifying I was 18, and I signed a paper certifying that I wanted to be in the Army, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And we went home, and I think it was the next day, he put me in a streetcar. We didn't have a car in those days, and I went down by myself, and they gave us lunch, locked us in a room, closed us in a room, and told us none of us could come out until we could memorize our serial number.
Mm-hmm.
I can still say 1604-1919, which was my enlisted serial number.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was shipped to Battle Creek.
Yeah, Fort Custer. That's where everybody went. Yeah.
Fort Custer, which was quite an active place in those days. Didn't stay there long. 2 days. We got our uniforms and that sort of thing, and then went to a lot of different places. But the main place I stopped was St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks.
All right.
And I was in the Army Air Corps.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the Army Air Force. And when I was told that I could not apply for pilot school because of my defective color vision, I decided that aerial photography would be almost a satisfactory substitute. So I chose aerial photography and was sent out to Denver to attend that school.
Okay. Now, before you got out to that school, about how many weeks or months had you been in training in different places before that?
Fort Custer. There was one more in Illinois, and I can't.
Well, had you done a kind of a basic training thing already?
Oh, yeah,
marching
we did.
around and.
Did basic training essentially at St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks.
Okay.
And in our spare time, we built the tent city that the other thousands would occupy when they came along.
Okay.
And with all the other, I was in Denver in aerial photography school when Pearl Harbor happened. And
Now, describe the kind of training or education you got at the aerial photography school. What was that like?
well, first of all, we had basic camera work and learned all about the 4x5 speed graphics and went around snapping each other's pictures and that sort of thing. And there was a fair amount of academic work. And eventually we were allowed to go along in airplanes that were taking photographs, and we were told at that time that that's about all there was to know about aerial photography. I was sent to Montgomery, Alabama to work in the photo lab there.
Okay. Well, when you're training and doing this photography initially, were you using handheld cameras? Were you using ones that were mounted into the planes, or what did you have?
In the planes, when we were doing aerial photography, to be used in maps, to make maps,
Right.
and that's what I did when I was in the lab at Montgomery.
All right. About when did you get down there? Well, actually, let's back up a little bit here. You mentioned you were in Colorado at the time you heard about Pearl Harbor, and you had the first reaction of not knowing where the heck that was. Did anything change in terms of the way training was working, or people were acting, or anything else like that once you actually were at war?
Yeah, everything was speeded up. My class finished, it's hard to remember exactly, but a week or a week and a half before we normally would have. A lot of them were shipped out of the Philippines, not in my class, but some. So apparently there was some knowledge that if we went to war, it was going to be with Japan. And I sat one Sunday morning with the first sergeant going through all the little booklets for service records for all the men in our unit, and we all had a stamp, and over the statement about discharge to be on, we stamped the duration of hostilities plus 6 months. And we were sitting there, and he says, "Here, you better do this one." And it was mine. And it occurred to me that evening that those stamps had to have been made well before we used them. Somebody knew about them.
Now, were people being sent to the Philippines before Pearl Harbor then?
Yeah.
Okay. Because we did have a substantial Air Force out there that got destroyed on the ground on the first day, but we had them.
Yeah.
All right. Now, then you're going down. See, Montgomery was the next place.
Yeah.
Okay. Describe what that was like down there and what we were doing.
Well, I was going to photo school, and then I went to a third course called camera repair, which is exactly what it sounds like, and the total examination at the end of it, they were in such a hurry, or the sergeant was being funny. He showed me a piece of metal, and he said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's a, let me see, actuating cam stop lever release spring." And he says, "That's good enough." And I had, every once in a while, I do remember that. While I was at Denver, or while I was at Montgomery, and that was only a few months long, I saw that they were trying to find pilots for gliders. And I thought, well, maybe that is another way to do what I want to do. I want to fly. One of my very small legends, I guess, is I literally was flown the first time by Charles Lindbergh. My dad and I paid in an old Ford Tribe motor, and my second oldest son, who's a retired colonel, he and I flew in the same airplane many years later. But what was I?
You were talking about trying to become a glider pilot.
Oh, yes. And I passed the physical, and I was correct in that they didn't pay much attention to my defective color vision because you're on a one trip on a glider, and what difference does it make? I passed and was sent to Waco, Texas, where I went to glider school, and we flew a number of different kinds of small gliders, and then the big one, which would hold about 15 people, if I remember correctly. We each made 2 landings in that, and that finished that. But by then they had so many glider pilots that there was no way they were going to use them all. So they put us in a camp. And for those who understand what I'm talking about, everybody but master sergeants and technical sergeants did guard duty, did KP, and everything else. And one day, I looked at the bulletin board, and the artillery was looking for liaison pilots. So I wrote my name down on the board, and first thing you know, I'm up for a physical, and passed that somewhere too. I don't think it was a very complex exam, because the artillery really did need pilots. Then I was sent to Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma.
That's the main artillery school.
That's right, at the artillery school at Post Field. And, oh, I'm sorry. Before that, before I went to there, I spent my first flying as a pilot was in Spencer, Iowa. and that was 10 weeks. And then we went to glider school, and then we went to, because in Spencer the course was pre-glider.
Mm-hmm.
Then I transferred to the artillery, went to Fort Sill, Post Field, and then really learned to fly. I thought I did, but I didn't know how to fly.
What kind of plane did they have you in?
65 horsepower Cubs.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got out of Fort Sill, we could make that thing stand up and say, yes, sir. We used to play a game on Sunday afternoon in which we would bet $1 a foot on where we could land the tail wheel
Mm-hmm.
of that airplane.
How much runway did you need to land one of those?
Well, I could be in the air if I were alone, and almost always I was alone during combat. 500 feet was plenty,
Mm-hmm.
unless you had a big obstacle, of course, to clear.
Now, when you were doing the training there, did you fly in all kinds of weather conditions, or were there limits to what you did?
No, it had to be pretty fair because we had no instruments to do any instrument flying
Mm-hmm.
with. If you couldn't see the ground, you were in trouble.
All right.
You could tell what direction the ground was, but that's about all.
Now, when you're doing the flight training and so forth, are you also beginning to train in doing the actual work as a spotter, with radios and all of that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And how did that work, or what kinds of things did you have to do?
Well, we learned the elements of artillery on how to tell the ground people where the shot went in
Mm-hmm.
comparison to the target, and over, short, left, right, etc. And we didn't have a great deal of that then. We knew the elements of it, but the main job at Fort Sill was to teach us to really fly. We would take off and land on curved roads,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes we would take off from fields that were obviously too short
Mm-hmm.
by getting over in one corner, going as fast as we could, and turn around and still going faster, and then all kinds of tricks. One of the instructors there said something that's always been a great memory to me. He said, "Pearson, you don't get into that airplane, you put it on.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes part of you." And then after that was over, when I was shipped out to the Mojave Desert, just north of Needles in California, and joined the 4th Armored Division, our 22nd Armored Field Artillery Battalion, which was about the luckiest thing that happened to me during the war, except not earning a Purple Heart.
Mm-hmm.
They were a great group. We were on maneuvers, and we all learned how to shoot, to do it accurately.
Mm-hmm.
Each battalion had 2 airplanes. We moved around the Mojave all over until we moved the whole division, except tanks and really heavy material, to Brownwood, Texas at Camp Bowie, and continue the same kinds of things that we had been doing up over in the desert.
Were you working with sort of a specialized team within the battalion? I mean, ground personnel who were communicating with you and then communicate to the artillerists, or how did that communication work?
Well, since I was the first pilot assigned to the division, I was senior and chief of the air section.
Mm-hmm.
And I had another pilot, a mechanic, and a truck driver, and a gopher
Mm-hmm.
in my 5-unit, a 6-unit, including me. And we functioned pretty well independently. We had to keep in contact with the battalion, of course. Our radio had only 2 channels. Now they have hundreds of channels. They have 2 channels, which meant there was only 2 other people I could talk to at any given moment, and I had to go back and turn a switch way behind me to do that.
Okay. And who would you be talking to?
Be talking to Fire Direction Center from the battalion.
Okay.
I could talk to the battalion commander, but rarely was that necessary.
Right.
Sometimes he called me to find out what was around the next corner or something like that. But almost always I would talk to the Fire Direction Center, whose chief, Major Mason, who ended up as a Major General. We got along just fine. And
Now, did you get to know very many of the personnel in the battalion? I mean, there's
Oh,
this
yeah.
major, and then so.
oh yeah, knew them all. Knew well, not the whole battalion, but I certainly knew the officers.
Right.
There were 35 of us.
Right.
And as far as I know, there's 3 of us left. Major Mason is one, Lou Jordan is another, who's old and feeble, and I'm the third, and certainly the youngest of the 3.
Okay. Now, did most of these people have college education or some college, or were they a mix of people?
I think all the officers in the battalion except me had college educations, with the exception of my other pilot had graduated from a community college and had an associate's degree. I was the only one just out of high school.
Right. Okay.
And we were sergeants in those days, by the way. It was at Fort Sill, or at Camp Bowie, that we found out we could become officers if we would study and pass a artillery officer's basic school. And we did, of course. And I always tell people I spent 2.5 years being an enlisted man and 2.5 years being an officer. And being an officer is better.
All right. Yeah, I mean, did things change sort of materially once you have an officer's rank? Do you eat differently, or go someplace and sleep somewhere else to sleep, or anything else like that? Or how did it make a difference?
Generally, the 2 pilots would take care of ourselves, but the driver would be responsible for rolling up the bedroll and getting it in the car and getting things packed. We were busy flying the automobiles, or flying the planes, I should say. And
Okay, so that's sort of summer of '43 then, when you're down there. And then from there, did they ship you over to Europe, or did you have other places to go?
No, we went from the desert over to Europe.
All right. What was it like sort of getting all of this stuff organized to go over?
I don't want to be facetious, but I guess I'll be facetious. To me, there was none. I went home on leave for just a few days, and it was all done. None of our artillery, except the trucks and all that sort of thing, moved with us.
Okay.
You moved the people over, and there was new equipment when we got to England.
So that part's relatively simple then.
Yeah.
All right. And then where did you ship out from?
Boston.
Okay. And then what time of year was it that you were leaving?
Just after January of '44.
Okay.
Because we had dinner at a nice restaurant in Boston, and shipped out a day or 2 later.
Okay. And then what kind of transport were you on?
We were on, and it'll take older people watching this to know what I'm talking about. The ship was called the Oriente. It was an Army troop ship. It was also the sister ship to the Morro Castle. As a historian, you probably know what happened to the Morro Castle. And that spooked us all the way over to England, because maybe us too, but it was an uneventful voyage. We saw couple whales and a very reassuring line of destroyers on the outside of the convoy.
Did you have any U-boat scares while you were going across? Okay.
Not a one.
And then what was the weather like? I mean, January isn't always
Raining.
great. Yeah.
Saw a few small water spouts, and as somebody pointed out, if the weather was miserable for us, it was for the people in the submarines also. So we didn't have any alerts or anything at any time.
All right. And then where did they land you in Britain?
In the Bath-Bristol area, but we all didn't land at the same.
Right.
But I think my battalion landed in Bath, and then we went to by train to the Devizes area, Devizes,
Southwestern England then.
southwestern England. Old army barracks, but they were perfectly fine for. The division or the battalion had its own little conclave, and we worked hard. We worked hard. We were worried. You know, do we know enough? Do we know enough? Is this enough to take us into combat and survive?
Did you have aircraft waiting for you to start using again, or did
Yeah,
they
they were already there.
And did you have problems getting flying time in with weather and that sort of stuff because you're kind of winter and spring and?
No, we could fly. The requirement was only 4 hours a month to get your flying pay.
Right.
And but we usually got 50 hours a month of various kinds. The weather was not all that bad.
Now, did you spend any time kind of in the community or among the civilian population, or did you just stay in?
Very little. I went into Devizes to have a beer now and then, and they were very friendly. Glad we were there, but there was nothing in particular. So, having access to an airplane, I decided that as long as I was in England, if I had the time, I would see London.
Okay.
And I did on several occasions. In fact, at Westminster Abbey, I had a man an old, white-haired, small man in black silk stockings and bloomers, who was my personal guide to Westminster Abbey. And those were great times. Obviously, we were all upset. We didn't know when the war was going to be. I'm one of the very few that did know when the invasion was going to be, but I didn't know until the evening before. It's one of my favorite stories. I had been to London and was coming back and went to the battalion mess hall and told the officers that I knew when the invasion was going to be. And, come on, I was the junior officer, only commissioned a few months before that. I said, okay, up to about $50, I'll take your bets. So they did. And I said, during the night tonight or tomorrow morning. And what I had seen as I went by a British RAF field was that they were against all regulations painting the invasion stripes on the gliders. And the orders were to not put them on until the night, the dark of the 5th it would be, June.
Okay. Now, were the Germans doing aerial reconnaissance over England at that time?
Once in a while we would hear, in our section, very rarely, there would be we were so far from the English coast, and one of the things, for one thing, the Germans didn't have any heavy bombers in the same sense.
No, they didn't.
Ours did, so it was rather difficult to do reconnaissance in our area, although once in a while we'd hear an airplane that we couldn't account for, didn't know what it was, but it was being dark. And we used to call him Bed Check Charlie. He'd come over and make sure we were all tucked in.
Okay. Now, were they worried more about aerial reconnaissance spotting things, do you think, or just spies or people on the ground who could see the stripes getting painted on there?
Oh, as far as the very units, they were not kept. For instance, the 4th Armored Division, the Germans must have known all along where we were. It wasn't, they didn't need airplanes.
Yeah.
We had 4th Armored Division on every bumper of every vehicle.
I was just thinking more about the whole prohibition about painting the invasion stripes onto your stuff and that.
No, that was just a temporary thing.
Right.
That was,
Okay. And so was that sort of how you figured it out, that you just saw the aircraft on the ground and you didn't get
well, I
told by
knew
somebody
we
else?
we had paint to paint the Cubs if we, I shouldn't call them Cubs, we called them L4s, to paint if we went in early in Normandy, but we didn't. We didn't fly over till D plus, I think it was 38. I've got it written down.
So you're basically still sitting there in England for another month after the invasion gets started. What were you doing during that time?
Almost every day we were on maneuvers, doing all kinds of unusual things. Our division commander was very well known among professionals. In fact, when my son was a lieutenant colonel, I visited him at his post in Texas, and he said, "Come here, I want to have you meet somebody." And it took me over to a 3-star general, and the general says, "You're in the 4th Armored? Did you know P. Wood?" Yeah, took him for many airplane rides. Oh my God, you should be so proud. And it was a famous division. In fact, as an aside, Patton published a statement that never in the history of human warfare has any division accomplished as much. There has been no finer fighting unit than the 4th Armored Division. We got the first unit citation for a whole division. Up until then, there'd been none.
All right. Of course, that still at this point is ahead of you because the unit hasn't been in combat yet.
No.
And you're training now during this period. I mean, were at this point, were you taking the division commander up with you sometimes, or other officers up with you?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he got to like watching his troops from above, even after we got to France. Not with me, but he had his own air crew, or there was one in Division Artillery, and he became relatively famous for running a division from the air back, and he had a fancier radio than we did. He could talk to more than two people. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you go over then, if it's around D plus 38, it's kind of middle of July when you actually get over to France. Where did they land you? Did you go in over
we were
a
in
beach?
Utah.
Okay, you landed in Utah.
And although Charlie Carpenter, who was the chief pilot for the division, had some coordinates where we were supposed to go, they were very difficult. And we flew up and down. We knew it was Utah, and we knew the boundary markers there. And we finally saw a bunch of other L4s in a field, and we landed there, and then we found out where we were supposed to do. It's like driving into a gas station and saying, "Where's Oakley Woods Drive?" You know?
Right.
And,
Okay. Now, you get in there. Now, how soon was it after that you started actually going on combat patrols?
I was trying to give you the exact date, but I registered the 22nd, 3 or 4 days after we landed. Because there weren't far to travel to be on the front line.
Right. Because they're
We
still in the...
We hadn't broken out in Operation Cobra, if you know. know what that was.
Yeah, so you're still fighting they're still fighting in the Bocage country.
Oh yes, hated them because there was hardly enough room to get an airplane up and down, and if we did, it probably wasn't near the battalion.
Right. Now, could you see much when you flew over the German lines in that country?
We didn't fly over the German lines particularly.
Did you fly above your own and kind of look forward?
Yeah, we could see that there were lots of people over there, and there was equipment and an awful lot of horses. The Germans used a lot to pull their artillery pieces,
Right.
and we could see that, and we never intentionally shot at just horses, but we did. If there were a lot of them, did she say she was going to be downstairs? Yeah, she did. But it was getting closer and closer, and our whole division, at one time, this is secondary data, but at one time, we were holding less than 1,000 yards of front. That's the whole division.
Yeah.
As we were getting ready for Cobra. And until then, George Patton was not our commander. I don't know if you know him.
Right, because initially you were all First Army.
Yeah, yeah. And when we broke out, the Third Army was activated. He became the... Can I tell one story about Patton?
Sure.
When we were in England, we got a division officer's call and had no idea what it was. We got in this big theater and quiet, and George Patton walked onto the stage, no big flag behind him as in the movie, but he had his pearl-handled and the rest of it, and he told stories, one of which I will never forget, that he had just come, well, he told us he was going to command Third Army, and, but he had just got back from Africa, and one of the things in an armored column, if there are trees and everything, there's corners, you always put an officer in a Jeep so he can get out and look around, make sure there's not an 88 looking down his throat. And they had this second lieutenant that was doing that, and he was doing fine, and then one time he decided that he had done that enough, there were no Germans in the area, so he didn't. And an 88 blew him and the Jeep and his driver all to smithereens. And there was a dramatic pause. Must have lasted 15 seconds. And Patton said, "Gentlemen, I'm glad that son of a bitch is dead." I was sitting behind two chaplains. You can imagine what happened to them. They were told, I understand the next day, they were told that it was not good politics to write to the chief of chaplains about George Patton. But I'll never forget that. I'm glad that son of a bitch is dead. I don't want him in my outfit. And, okay,
well, what sort of impression did that actually make of you? I mean, did you think, gee, that was funny, that the guy's a big jerk, or he's an impressive character, or?
He's an impressive character, certainly. We knew he had a reputation for being a leader. In fact, he's the only one we knew. You know, Eisenhower had never commanded troops. Bradley had never commanded any small units, had no real combat experience in that. And we were glad to hear that we were going to have Patton. It eventually, you know, when we broke out of Normandy, and we'd look from the air, we'd look and say, we're going to go here and from here to there, and we're going to get our butts killed. But 24 hours after we did break out, we, to use the old phrase, we have followed Patton to hell.
Can you describe sort of your perspective on the breakout or that whole operation as they're finally pushing out of the Bocage country and getting out into the open? What did that look like to you, or what was your part of that?
I remember it clearly. As clearly as Normandy, the day that we were out on the Salisbury Plains watching thousands of bombers head for France. And I didn't know personally at my level when we were going to break out, but I can remember seeing many, many, many hundreds of bombers softening up the Germans. In fact, General McNair was killed in that bombing by
so they were doing carpet bombing there. So,
friendly bomb. And I guess my attitude at that time, well, a lot of training, a lot of flying. This is it, whatever it is. Here we go. And the danger to the liaison pilots was the divisions went out as much as they could on the roads, which didn't give the area between the roads any safety as far as we were concerned. If we flew above the column, it was both sides. Infantrymen or anybody with a rock, as somebody said, could take a whack at us. But that really was the attitude that, my God, Patton said we could do it, and we did it, and let's go.
Now, were you doing spotting work when the breakout attack began? I mean, were you actually helping at that point? All right.
No, there was no, none of us were in the air. We were watching those bombers for one thing. We knew that there were. I had been in the air that morning, and I could see that the infantry out in front had laid colored panels in several areas, which was where the German or the American bombers were to go at least that far. And of course, I thought that means we were going to go that day. And then the order came down that all the liaison planes were to be grounded until the division moves.
All right. So then when did you get back up again?
As soon as the division started moving. Because we had to keep up with them, because that was my mama. I had to stay. She had my milk. She had my gasoline.
So were you changing airstrips and things like that?
Oh, yeah.
Pretty frequently?
I remember one where we used 5 different strips in a day. But the average was about 2. And part of our chief mechanic's task was to look at fields while we were out, and to use, that we could use that night, because the airfields we used at night were withdrawn from the front. We didn't want to be right up in the front. One time we did, and got some artillery shells coming in. We decided that wasn't very pleasant. In fact, they were probably armor piercing. And all we really heard was thump, thump. And they buried themselves. I remember hollering, "Get your vehicle out of here," and hollering to the other pilot, "Get in the air." And the mechanic said, "You want me to crank you?" And I said, "You get your ass out of here." And that's what I'm going to do. But that was the only time we ever had any fire at the airfield themselves. It was just strips. Sometimes we used a road.
Now, during this sort of breakout period there, where the division was moving relatively quickly in northern France, did the divisional artillery have much to do, or were you just mostly moving from place to place and just trying to...
The divisional artillery was shooting from side to side if they saw anything. When you say division artillery, that to me means the division artillery headquarters, which have no.
Well, I was just saying,
cannon.
well, divisional as with an adjective, as in the
Yeah.
battalions attached to the division,
yeah.
including yours.
Yeah. And if we saw something, we'd point it out. That was our job at that point. We'd point it out and sometimes even give them an azimuth by flying over them and saying that range 4,000, throw one out there.
Okay. Now, the way you were flying, did you have problems with anti-aircraft fire or anything like that? I mean, the
Yeah.
Germans shoot at you?
A lot of them. First mission I flew, one went off, a mile away. And my first thought was, those bastards are trying to kill me. And the feeling was, I wrote it in my section of the book, that they have no right to try to kill me. I haven't done anything to them yet, so. But later, a artillery shell going off that far away might have gone into consciousness, but nothing. So, I mean, it wouldn't have. But there were plenty of close ones down by Ohrdruf. I had one or so close that I saw the gunner pull the lanyard.
Yeah, well, how high were you normally off the ground?
Oh, anywhere. We tried to keep around 500, 600. Sometimes we'd be up to 15 if we had to get that high to see. But very rarely. We wore chutes, but I never knew of any liaison pilot that ever used a chute.
Because if you're that low to the ground, you might not have time to
Well,
deploy. Or
What we said jokingly was, to hell with a chute, I'll ride the biggest piece down. Because,
But was it fairly common for observers to get shot down or to take damage on their planes?
yeah, I don't know exactly how many of ours were, but it was high. There were, let's see, there were 2, 4, 6, there were 9 pilots in the whole division. And we lost at least 7 to being shot down and killed, or one man I remember, my other pilot was taken back for psychiatric reasons. So it was a fairly dangerous occupation.
Okay. Now, were you getting much rest or relief during this phase here, the advance, or were you in the air every day? And
Well, every day, but we couldn't fly at night. And since each unit had 2 planes, at least I tried to keep one of us in the air at all times, which meant that the hours built up very fast.
Yeah.
Altogether, it's something over 9,000 hours of combat. Combat being defined where I was in harm's way.
Right. Okay. Typically, how long would you be in the air at once, or how long would you stay in the air when you're out on these patrols?
Normally an hour and a half at a time. We had 12 gallons of gasoline sitting in our lap. If you've ever been in a Cub, it sits right here. And it burned about 4 hours a gallon, or 4 gallons an hour. And on occasion, I made it last longer than 4 hours. But generally, we tried an hour and a half. And if there were 2 of us up there at the same time, as one was finishing something that he had started, why, it was all right. We were both getting time.
Now, in this phase, when you're in France and breakout and pursuit in that period, are there particular memories or images that stick in your mind from things that you were able to see up in the air that were particularly striking or gave you some sense of how things were going in one direction or another? And do you see, Germans retreating or
If
destroying
there's a
vehicles?
stronger word than chaos, I don't know it, and that's what it seemed to be. And I had the best view of anybody in the division. It was just, we went from the breakout down to Ohrdruf, and then crossed the Brittany Peninsula, ended up in Val, and saw lots of Germans, killed lots of Germans, and a lot of our people were killed too. And that's when General Wood had the big fight with General Patton. They were classmates at West Point. And Wood wanted to turn left rather than cross the Brittany Peninsula.
Right.
And Patton said, no, you go over and cut off the peninsula. And Wood is supposed to have said, I'm going to go south. And Patton is supposed to have said, if you go south, I will court-martial you. To which Wood responded, well, somebody ought to be court-martialed. But he did as he was told.
Okay. Now, what kind of impression did you have of sort of the French countryside or whatever, or people or anything else like that in that period?
There are two sides to that. When we got, generally they were just great. They'd come out with a bottle of wine and a bunch of eggs and all that sort of thing to give us. But when we were down at Val, I landed at the Strip late one afternoon. It was still daylight, and some members of the FFI, the Free French of the Interior, several of them came, and each of them had a bottle of wine. They gave it to me, and then they took me by the arm and sort of marched me, maybe a quarter of a mile away to a church. And they had captured some sympathizers, and they executed them. And I remember that, and remember I was just barely 21 years old. My moral virginity was lost that day to see them. They lined them up one at a time to shoot them, as a matter of fact, which was totally unnecessary. And they used some tracer bullets, which would go through the person, hit the wall of the church, and then fall to the ground, still burning. And that's the first time I vomited in France, after I got away from the FFIs.
So why do you think they brought you along there in the first place?
Well, wanted to share with me the great things that they were doing. Because the FFI did a great deal of help of the invasion of France. This business in the movies of waiting for certain codes, that was essentially true.
Yeah.
I talked to a number of Frenchmen who were in the underground, and they did. They cut roads, railroads, telephone wires,
Right.
did all kinds of things.
Now,
But
how long?
generally, to finish your question, you could have anything you wanted, including all the women, if that was your style. I was scared to death of women.
May have kept you healthier.
Well, that's my father's phrase. If you get a disease, there's no cure, in spite of what you hear. And if you get her pregnant, you're sure as hell going to marry her. But that was before the war. That was his attitude about sexuality and his sons. I had a sister and a brother, by the way. I'm the oldest.
All right. Now, we've got you, okay, you make the breakout, you go across Normandy, you get down to Vannes, and then at that point, do they sort of turn you eastward? And
Yeah, we went
okay.
east, and we were on the the southern flank of the Falaise Gap. Which was a great thing and a catastrophe too, because if it had been handled right, probably would have shortened the war considerably.
Now, at the time you're moving along with the division, at that point, I mean, in principle, there's the option there to cut off the Germans retreating out of Normandy before they get out. And the modern argument is sort of one of, well, how quickly should the gap have been closed and what should have been done and that sort of thing. Now, at the time that you were moving with the division and flying and so forth, did you have any idea about that sort of thing or
No,
possibilities?
no,
or you were just going where you were supposed to go? And
The most, you mean, of the whole picture? No. We pilots knew, and the chief of staff and his people, division commander knew where the division was, but very rarely, we might know that elements of the 10th Corps were on our left or something like that, but generally that was Falaise Gap. I was told to fly north to see what was on our flank. And so I went slowly out. Didn't see a thing, And finally I saw some smoke. And I went there very carefully and saw eventually that it was a United States Quartermaster Truck Company who was giving showers to GIs. So the gap was past us at that time. Then we went racing across Germany.
oh, across France, anyway.
Across France and into Germany. A lot of it is, I don't know if you ever read the Saturday Evening Post article called Rat Chase to the Rhine. It was from about Bastogne on, when one of our tank battalion commanders was George Abrams, if you know who he ended up as our Army Chief of Staff. Not only that, he predicted he was going to end up as Army Chief of Staff when he was Lieutenant Colonel. I heard him. The first part of that remark was right after the war. I asked, I was high point officer, the point system for deciding when people go
Right,
on.
yeah.
Okay, I was high point officer for the division. So they had me a little party. And Creighton was there, and he was sitting off in the corner with a bottle of wine, and I finally went on up to him and I says, Creighton, what the hell is wrong with you? And as God is my witness, the exact quote, he said, hi, Bob, I just thought of something. I said, what's that? That was a hell of a lot of fun.
Okay. Let's see. Move ourselves back a little bit here.
Sure.
We've been covering sort of the breakout and the movement across France. Now, eventually, you get into kind of northeastern France, the area around Metz and so forth, and the army pretty well stops, and you run into those fortifications and the Siegfried
We
Line.
enveloped Metz.
Yeah.
In fact, my son told me that is a classic thing they study in one of their Commander General Staff schools. I don't know what the 4th Armored Division did about Metz.
But Metz took an awfully long time to capture. That was not an easy place to...
Yeah, we were well beyond that.
Right.
We went around it and kept on going, and I don't remember what if the divisions took over. It was really a siege kind of thing.
Right, yes it was.
Yeah.
The infantry kind of took over in there. And then basically did you start running into sort of the Siegfried Line fortifications then at that point, German defenses of their own frontier?
Never knew where the Siegfried Line was. I'd show you on a map where it was, but the next important thing for our division was the Bastogne.
Right. Okay, now this tape is just about out, and that gives us a good spot here. Pause it.
Sorry to be You still have to hold on your shoulder.
Yeah, well, this technology's much nicer. Okay, we're back on here again. Now, basically, so was the Fourth Armored then, once they kind of get up toward the German frontier area, were you pulled back to rest and refit, or just put on a quiet part of the line, or were they attacking
Just
somewhere?
a quiet part of the line more than anything else.
Okay, and what was life like there in that period? If you've got a little bit of a lull there where you're not moving every day and you're not really doing a lot of attacking, were you still doing regular flights at that time, or?
Oh yeah, we kept, if division was in an area, we would cooperate with the other air sections to make sure somebody was watching things. But generally, I don't know of any, except when we all ran out of gas. I don't think we were in reserve. And what was it like? It was cold and it was wet, and it was long before Bastogne.
All right, and then what kind of barracks or accommodations did you have? Were you in tents or houses or what?
We had pyramidal tents, but we almost never used them because there wasn't time to. We all had sleeping bags. We would use abandoned farmhouses and things like that. And but the only time we used the pyramidal tents is when we had to do maintenance on one of the airplanes, and then we would pitch it so it was coming in the door, and we could do. We could grind valves on one of those overnight and have it running fine.
Now, did you ever replace your aircraft, or did you just keep fixing the ones you had?
Only when I got shot down.
Okay, and did you get shot down?
3.
Okay, and when was the first time that happened to you?
Let's put them in order here. Well, I can't figure out, and I could do it for you, but as I was coming back to an airfield one day, my mission was over and the other pilot was up. I was attacked by a German airplane. And one of the things we had learned was that once they take a pot shot at you, they didn't come back, because that would alert all the ground fire and all that sort of thing. Except this guy did come back. And as I was sitting fat, dumb, and happy almost on the ground, he literally sawed my tail off. And I went kerplunk. And when that sort of thing happened, we just burned the plane. And, but J.E., my mechanic, when he was getting all the radio out and everything, he says, "Over here." He says, "You were sitting there, right?" "Yep." "Let me see you get back in there." And I couldn't. And he said, "You were out of that plane before it hit the ground." Which means that I undid my safety belt and jumped from the time it was not more than about maybe 15 feet in the air.
Okay, and what were you landing on?
Just
ground? Or?
Just ground, yeah.
Okay, and did you get hurt?
Not enough to get a Purple Heart. I can't even tell you which one it was, but one of my hands was abraded and landed on it.
But on the whole, not so bad, considering that someone had just shot your tail off.
My luck was just, when I got out of the Army, I thought, well, I hope I haven't used it all up, because I sure used a lot of it. One time I was just flying along, fat, dumb, and happy, and all of a sudden, I had been trying to figure out where the lines were. And all of a sudden, my engine had stopped just like that. And what had happened is a bullet from below had pierced my oil sump and drained it out and all that sort of thing. So my thought was, well, here I am flying a glider again. And I had plenty plenty of room to land. And before I did, I called my air section, and they sent my mechanic and the driver out, and they replaced the engine, actually. And
So you didn't get to burn that plane?
no, we saved it that time. As a matter of fact, you asked how many were killed and that sort of thing. There was a permanent unit that did nothing but put Cub planes together. And if you smashed one up, you just flew back or had somebody fly you back and pick up a new one. And I can't remember, I'm getting a little foggy on what I suppose this wasn't getting shot down, but one time the strut on my plane had been struck by a bullet, and when I landed, the wing collapsed. But I was already on the ground and that.
Okay. Now, you have the period there at the kind of late 44, and things aren't happening, and then do you remember hearing about the Battle of the Bulge starting and figuring you were going to get into this pretty quickly, or?
Well, the general. We were to the south, Third Army, and we got orders. I just happened to be in battalion headquarters. We were in a cozy farm, getting ready to go to bed when the orders came down to be prepared to move out that night, which left me in an awkward position because I couldn't go with them.
Right.
So, and we knew that there was someplace up in the Ardennes that they needed Third Army. And so I made sure that the plane was full of gas and 2 5-gallon cans in the back seat in case I could had to land someplace and could go on. And then I sat in the field while they all drove on. First time I saw even a glimmer of the sun coming up by, I was in the air because the Germans apparently took a while finding out that the whole Third Army had been withdrawn. And it would have, if they'd have had the troops at that time, that would have been a catastrophe for us because they could have come up and enveloped us.
Well, there still were units holding the line. The whole army didn't leave.
Not all.
But yes, if the Germans had larger
90%
reserves,
of
they could have. But there was, the lines were thinner. But anyway, it was still a pretty big movement and a quick one.
And they left some machine guns and some artillery to make noise. And so I followed them up. Finally found them. Took me a whole day.
How did you figure out where to land?
I flew along. I had figured, in fact, I wrote it out, that when I was in school, I was very good at story problems. And that the unit traveled at 10 miles an hour, and at normal cruise, my speed was about 65, 70 miles an hour, and I was going into the wind. So maybe I was making 50 miles an hour to their 10. So I should catch them here. But when I got on the radio and started giving them my call signs, no one answers, no one answers. And finally I had to get gas and had some of my own, but I saw a bunch of L4s on the field down there, and I landed and had them gas me, so I'd still have some gas. And finally an MP came along and said, "What's your unit?" I told him, and he says, "I think they're so-and-so." And when I flew to that spot, I got a response on the, never occurred to me till just now, but there was no other plane with me. My partner had been shot down just before that. So I was the only one with the battalion.
Now, what were you able to see kind of as you're heading up toward Bastogne and then moving forward? Do you have much of a sense of it? Was there sort of snow on the ground that you made it easier to see units and things like that? Or?
Yeah, it was. You can see units, and you get a sense of whether that's a German vehicle or not. You may not be able to see the star or the swastika on it or the Black Cross, but you got a pretty good idea just looking at those.
The shape of the turret or things like that? Yeah.
Oh yeah, if you couldn't, being in an armored division, if you couldn't pick out all the various tanks, you were in real trouble.
Right. Now, how much of that time were you able to get in the air? I mean, it's winter and there had been a lot of weather problems going in.
We flew every day. We flew every day. You know, in the just south of Bastogne, a few miles, a little town of Assenois.
Okay.
I was told to register each of our battalions and one 8-inch howitzer on that city. And other airplanes registered their people on it. And then they had what, you know what a TOT is?
Was that where you fire absolutely everything you have in one spot?
That's when you figure out how long it'll take your shells to get there so that all of them will arrive at the same spot. And at that time, we were told that was the biggest TOT that had ever been fired. I have no idea how many, but it broke S-1 back, and Abrams went on up. And of course, what people don't realize is that once we relieved Bastogne, the Germans attacked south of Bastogne again and held that part, because although we got there, they closed in behind us, and it was December 28th, there before you could say you could bring things into Bastogne like food.
So you had what the 4th Armored brought with them, and then not a lot else.
And before that, too, one of the important things, we did get a break in the weather, and the planes could drop things into Bastogne, too. At great cost, as a matter of fact. I saw that. There were lots of C-47 shot down that day, I'd say.
So now, were you flying, once the division got there, were you flying out of Bastogne, including when it was cut off, or were you farther back still?
We were farther back south,
Okay.
I never got into Bastogne.
Yeah.
There wasn't much left to get into.
No. And then did the division continue attacking from there, or push back south?
No,
or?
we went east from there. And matter of fact, one of the little stories is that when Patton congratulated, oh my God, I can't even remember the name, who was in command at Bastogne. McAuliffe, thank you. And so Patton's staff said something about, you must have taken tremendous casualties. And McAuliffe said, I'm ready to fight. We got a whole unit. Whereupon Patton asked him, what direction are you going to go? And McAuliffe backed down and said he didn't have enough troops. He was braggadocio. Which did not endear him to members of the 4th Armored. So we went somewhere across the Siegfried line from there, and it was pretty much a rat chase. There was not any great battles after that.
You'd have been fighting Germans in kind of one position and another and another, and not really big counterattacks or things like that in that period. From your perspective, did you notice sort of changes, I don't know, in morale or attitude or whatever of the people you were working with over the course of time? Was confidence building, or were people getting tired of it, or what was going on?
I have never seen a group, even a small group, that had the esprit that all members of the 4th Armored did.
Mm-hmm.
We were the best. We'd laugh. Axis Sally one time at night said that no one would ever allow Roosevelt's butchers onto German territory. And we all laughed. And then one night, before we had relieved Bastogne, she said, just before she was signing off, said, "Oh, by the way, you fellas in the 4th Armored Division, in case you've forgotten it, the password tonight is Andrew Jackson."
Mm-hmm.
And she was right. That was the password.
Oh.
Good propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I ended up in Czechoslovakia. I led the column up over the 4th Armored column, up over the hills to, we were supposed to go to Regensburg. And we did, as a matter of fact. But that's the morning that I broke radio silence, as I pulled up over the hill and said, there was an old, you know who Spike Jones was?
Mm-hmm.
He had a song that started out, "The years have come and the years have gone, but the oft-told tale is not true. For of all the things the Danube is not blue."
Mm-hmm.
And there she was sitting in all her yellow glory, and
Mm-hmm.
I knew we were.
Okay. Now let's back up a little bit across Germany.
Sure.
I mean, what was the experience like, kind of going into Germany and moving across it? I mean, you were now starting to land on strips and so forth in Germany itself. Was there a difference between the countryside or the people or anything else like that?
We couldn't have any contact with them.
Mm-hmm.
That was not allowed, dude.
Okay.
You were literally fined $65 for talking to a German.
Now, was that specific to people with your kind of job, or?
Anybody, as far as we knew,
Okay.
you could not talk to Germans.
Because in a lot of other units they did, or at least I've talked to plenty of people who did, but they didn't have the kind of assignment that you did.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But at least in your outfit, you just stayed away from them.
We were told that it's an absolute.
Okay.
You just don't do it.
So where would they put you up during the night then, as you're going forward? Were you still taking over buildings, or sleeping out in the open?
If we could, otherwise we'd get on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I've often said some of the best night's sleep I've ever had was followed in the morning by brushing snow off the top of my
Mm-hmm.
bedding roll. But we slept in our clothes,
Mm-hmm.
took our boots off, but kept the boots in the bedding roll.
Now, what did Germany look like to you as you were going through it? I mean, did you see a lot of bomb damage or things like that, or was it mostly open country? Or
We didn't get it to any of the big cities,
Mm-hmm.
except we got in sight of Koblenz,
Mm-hmm.
went all up the Moselle, a lot of little cities
Mm-hmm.
that there wasn't much left. I didn't really get a good view of Koblenz. I did see where the Remagen Bridge was.
Mm-hmm.
There was a division on our left, and one of the pilots from the 4th Armored had said he thought the bridge was intact,
Mm-hmm.
and he called back, only having 2 people to talk
Mm-hmm.
to, called back, who sent it back, and when it got to division headquarters, they sent it to the 9th Armored,
Mm-hmm.
and they made a run for the bridge and made it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there after the war. But
Now, at some point, I think you had mentioned earlier that you had, at one point in this process, seen one of the death camps. Was that on the advance across Germany, or did you see it after the war was over? Or?
April 4th,
Okay.
the war was not over.
Nope.
Name's that.
And,
I was flying, I suppose, back from a mission, and I saw a bunch of people, hundreds and hundreds of, maybe not that, 100 people, maybe. And I couldn't figure out what they were, and they were all in an enclosure of some kind. So I landed on the road, which was just a country road, ruts, alongside, which you could do in a car. And I walked over and saw it was Camp Ohrdruf, Ohrdruf, of which there's a very great website, by the way. And walked in, and it was certainly within the first hour or so of the Germans abandoning it, you know, and the elements of the Fourth Armored walking in.
so were there some of your own unit already there?
Yeah. There were, as I say, I don't know what, I certainly wasn't number one, but I was in the first group, first hour, and there were bodies laying over, and some of the photographs that you see in the various museums, like in Washington, and it was several days later before Eisenhower and Patton and Bradley got to visit that, but it was saying apparently people had not moved the bodies. I don't know whether they kept them there for the photographic effect or not, but my unit took pictures of that, and the bodies were exactly the same.
And did you see any survivors there too?
Yeah, they brought, survivors, yeah, there were some alive, yeah. I remember some of them were in pretty good shape, but some of them I heard from the medics were just beyond help, and they tried to give them IVs and all that sort of thing, and they just went on and died. There were some, but there were dead bodies laying all over. Just their method of getting rid of bodies was railroad ties, layer of bodies with railroad ties, and that doesn't get rid of the bones, of course.
Now, before you had gotten there, did you have much of an idea of what the Germans had been doing, or that this sort of thing was going on?
We had heard of the death camps and wrote it off as, nonsense. You know, no human being would do that sort of thing to another human being, kill millions of Jews. And I didn't know until after the war, sometime after the war, that the Russians had run into a death camp almost a year before Ohrdruf.
Yeah.
And we were never told what to expect.
There had been a lot of camps in sort of what had been sort of Poland and places like that. And as the Russians got in there, the Germans tried to evacuate them or cover up, but they didn't always do a very good job. Yeah, but the full publicity for that kind of thing wasn't really out yet.
Ohrdruf was a relatively small gang. It was only, I think, somebody said there was only 4,000 had been killed there, which made it a relatively small extermination point.
But they also had a lot of camps that were essentially prison camps where they let them die rather than finish them all off at once too.
Yeah, they work them until they're dead. That's all.
Right. Now, was that the only time you had to encounter that sort of thing, or did you see more of it as you went on?
No, the war was over. That was April, early April. I think it was the 4th. And the war was over the 8th of May. And I spent a couple hours or more flying up and down the refugees trying to get behind American lines, dropping leaflets, which had to have been printed a while back.
So the idea was you were trying to help refugees get away from the Soviets
Yeah,
and into
that's what they
American
promised. I
home.
wish I had brought one home. It'd be a great souvenir. That will be of all the help we can, etc.
Right.
And then they had the party for me and the colonel who was number 2 in points. And that was the end. I drank too much. I woke up in a car some 100 miles or so on the way to Ohrdruf. So that's my story.
Well, that still gets us kind of only to the middle of 1945. And you said you're not discharged officially until early in 46. So what did you do then after that?
Well, the Army thought I was going to go home and be discharged. But I thought, and I don't know, remember whether I decided on the way back or what, but for some reason I didn't feel comfortable getting out until the war was over. So I went to Chicago for reassignment and asked go back to Fort Sill and do some teaching. I could have gone west, but I elected not to.
West as in Pacific West, or just
yeah.
And
well, for one thing, as far as we know, the L4s were not very useful in this island warfare thing. So, and I was right in saying that I was by then a very good pilot. So I went back and asked if I could go to Fort Sill and teach. And after they sent me down there, and the chief pilot, whose name I still can remember, took me for a ride, and he remembered me from my student days. And I landed, and he said, I would be absolutely delighted to have you as an instructor. And then, I don't remember just when it was, because the getting out was so much terminal leave. And you know, they compute terminal leave, and then they figure out how much terminal leave you had accumulated on that. But I finally told the people in charge of Fort Sill that I thought it was time I became a captain. And one of the senior pilots, I was being administrative officers, went to Washington, flew up there, and came back and said, no promotions here now. And I said, goodbye. The war was over. I wanted to go to school.
And then is that what you did?
That's exactly what I did.
All right. And then what kind of academic training then did you get?
Well, I went to Wayne University and then went to medical school there.
And then what field of medicine did you go into?
Did 13 years of being a real doctor. General practice up in Boyne City, if you know where Boyne City is. And then decided that I'd always, because we had such a strong chief of psychiatry at Wayne, that I really wanted to go into psychiatry. I moved myself and my family down to Traverse City and took the residency there and ended up as the director of the adult services, which was, I was no kids and no very old people. And then I retired and they closed the hospital. Within, it really was months, and my superintendent had told me when I decided to retire, I had met Karen. We were not married. I do have 6 kids, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
5 are still alive. And that I was going to retire, and his response was, "Oh my God, you're the only other board-certified doctor here.
Mm-hmm.
They'll close us." No, don't be silly. So I retired in January. He retired in April, and they closed the hospital in May or June.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there other miscellaneous things that kind of stick in your mind about your period in the service that you haven't gotten into this account yet? There will be after I turn off the camera.
Oh, of course. One of my very dear friends, are you near the end of the tape? No. Okay. One of my very dear friends in Houston, after Karen and I were married, and by the way, we will have our 25th anniversary very shortly. He and I used to see each other fairly often. He had been the executive officer of the battalion. And we were talking about the war one time, which we rarely did. And one night he said, "You know, when we were kids and we used to see the movies about First World War and how the units stuck together and friends and all that sort of thing." He said, "You know what? There's no other bond in this world like 2 people who have been shot at and survived it." And I certainly believe that's true. That was I had troubles afterwards. I had what would now be post-traumatic stress disorder, mild. And that's been going quite a while, but it took. I was jumpy. In those days, we didn't do anything about it. We just, it'll go away.
You'd also mentioned, this is a little bit different, I think you'd mentioned before the interview that you were involved on the board of, was it a Holocaust museum or something like that in Houston?
Yeah.
Okay, could you tell us just a little bit about that and how you got to be involved with that?
Yeah, Karen and I both practiced in Houston. And I had decided, although I had retired from Traverse, I wanted to do psychotherapy rather than do hospital psychiatry and that sort of thing. So I limited my practice to psychotherapy. It was very, very pleasant. We did 12 years, I guess. And one day Karen said, "I have a lady here that was a prisoner at one of the camps. Would you like to talk to her?" Because I've asked her, and she said, "Yeah, she'd like to talk to me." So she did, and the Holocaust Museum in Houston was in the early days of formation, and she talked to me, and she talked to what board there was, and I got an invitation to be on the board, so I was on the board while we were building it. Matter of fact, my name is on one of the brass placards out in front of that, and that was quite an experience too, because there were many survivors on that board. There were some of the stories. Many of them would say that they never had spoken about anything about it until they ran across that group of people. I took an employee of mine when I was in Traverse City, and he came to me. He was chief steward, and he said, "Were you in one of the camps?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Which one?" I said, "Ohrdruf." And he said, "Okay, you wouldn't know about Ohrdruf unless you'd been there." Because this was, he says, "Can I talk to you?" I go, "Of course." time at about an hour a week for 6 months or so, and I heard some of the most terrible stories. He was in Buchenwald for, I don't know, 6 months, something like that. His wife finally bribed him out of there. Literally, the chief Jew from town had gone out and told the commander, he said, if you don't let him out, you're not going to get any cooperation from any of us in town. So, but anyhow, that was probably the thing I remember most about the war.
Now, to look back on the whole thing now, I mean, how do you think your time in the military sort of affected you as a person? Either how you look at the world or just anything else?
My book is dedicated, says, to Karen, who asked the question. And shortly after she was married, she heard me, or we were married, she heard me say something about the war. And finally she said, did the war affect you? And I said, I'm not sure, but I'll make some notes. And I started making notes, and notes begot notes begot notes. And yeah, it did affect me. I think it could not have affected. I was losing my naivete, for one thing. Hard to remember that in all the armed services, only like 2% ever get shot at and have that part of it. When you talk to a veteran, I have a grandson who just got back from Iraq, and he and I are the family veterans. I come from a family of veterans. My grandfather's brother, my father, me, my brother, my nephew, and now one grandson has spent time in service. And we're all proud of it. On special days, we email each other and say, good for us. We're not pacifists at all. My first thought is, let's nuke them, but I know better than that. And I would not if I could not. But you find out what people are capable of. It's a hard lesson. I don't think I ended up paranoid like a lot of people did. Suspicious of everything. I swore when I got back to this country that I would never, under any circumstance, set foot on German soil. But when my son commanded a battalion over there, we went over and visited him. It was all very friendly, with lots of Germans that were friendly. And the whole thing was, I thought it was put on at the time, but I've since become convinced that the Germans hate World War II. Not that they lost it, but there was just a catastrophe all around. That, it's against the law to display the swastika. And we went over there 3 times, as Mike would do a tour, and I think the Germans have handled post-World War II better than many countries have.
Yeah, well, I mean, the government as a whole did a lot to try to eventually acknowledge and recognize what had happened and make sure that the people themselves understood it in ways that the Japanese probably didn't do as systematically. And there's sort of more issues still with what the Japanese government will or will not own up to, as opposed to where the Germans are now. And you get current generation of Germans who've grown up afterward, kind of like, find a lot of it pretty horrifying too.
Yeah.
So they did manage to do that. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Delighted. This will go into the archives here with a copy to
Yes, yes, it will.
Washington.
Yeah. But the way it works is.
I'm absolutely astonished. I've talked about the war, and to my generations, there's only one more. I've given talks about it. I've written about it. I have many, many, many hours of tapes taped off the air off. And I usually talk without much emotion, but this interview, whether it's the fact that it's gone on for a while or some of the things just came back, I'm anxious, my heart's going fast. But the amazing thing is that has been over for 63 years. 63 years. Isn't that something?
Well, part of why we do this, I think, is because we recognize on some level that as a human experience, this was extreme and an uncliched version of that word. Something that most people never have to go through, and we don't want to put more people through. But in the meantime, if you lived with that, then you carry that with you. And it certainly has happened plenty of times as I've had this kind of interview, where people, they do start to put it together, and there is still that, it's still very fresh in certain ways in people's minds. And it's still, oh my God, I went through that, or saw that, or they don't
At
even always know
times,
why.
It's almost like I'm going through it.
Yeah. So you're not alone in that experience.
No, I'm sure I'm not. I should know enough about human behavior and emotions since I made my living at it for quite a while.
Well, thanks for that more interesting a comment coming from you then.
And I thank you, Dr.
All right.
Smithers. What did you say your first name was?